Thank you for bringing up the FracFocus. We're looking here at the map in terms of those states that are using FracFocus, those that require the chemical disclosure. And when you talk about best practices, it seems to make sense to have some kind of repository where we all know what everybody else is doing. And it's nice to see that you have some additional states that are in the process, and hopefully they will line up to use this kind of portal, if you will. What's the biggest complaint that you have with FracFocus, or in your view, what needs to be beefed up in order to make this be the information source, the repository that we would hope it to be?
I think we're addressing that with the XML submission. So previously, the system that was used was, it was paper, it was PDF. So it wasn't dynamic. It was just a snapshot. So now with XML, it truly is data. So we actually have data in the database. And so one can manipulate the data and extract the data as needed or as appropriate by that state regulatory agency.
And that's coming on now, then?
That's coming on next week, yes.
Okay. Okay.
Senator, the main complaint was that the information wasn't aggregable. I can't say it.
I got it.
Aggregated.
Aggregable. And that so it couldn't really be analyzed
Right.
and worked with. I think my friends at GWPC and IOGC are working on that. And,
So basically, the reason it was developed was for the individual landowner, to give them a question. If they had a question of what was going on in their backyard, they can look at the FracFocus site, they can view the information that happened there and answer that question. What chemicals are being used there? It wasn't ever really designed to do nationwide type aggregation. You're absolutely correct.
Got it.
Senator, if I could just mention for the record, version 2 has much improved search capabilities, which make it a much more useful tool. But it's also been adapted for use in Europe. It has been adapted for use in Canada, and Australia is looking at a similar tool based on the work we've done here in bringing FracFocus forward.
Yeah, this is going to my question too, because I'd read some article. In other words, actually, I was twice chairman of the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission when I was governor, and appreciate you coming. We invited you to be here, and I'm very appreciative that you're here, because the whole purpose with FracFocus is to provide transparency and disclosure, and trying to provide it in an actual usable format. And, there's a lot of ways to do this, and some groups want to do it in ways that, frankly, I think are counterproductive to understanding what's going on. And the whole purpose with FracFocus was to make it as understandable, so open, transparent, and as understandable for people as to what's really going on. And not, for example, if you use a lot of something and a trace element of something else, that would be reflected rather than them all just listed, so somebody could say, oh my gosh, look at this, there's all this in there when there isn't. So the whole idea was to make it user-friendly, understandable, transparent. Some of the articles I read, though, some organizations wanted to do data dumps to manipulate data. And so I think this question that's been brought up goes to that. Now, do we have all the flexibility in this system that reasonably provides people the ability to get the information they want? Now, again, some of them may want to do it to manipulate data, and if they do, I guess they do. But are there things in FracFocus, and I guess, we'll have a chance here when we eventually get through all the statements to ask that question for some of the other folks too, but in your opinion, have you or are you accommodating the request so that people can get the data in whatever form they want, so that that's not a continuing criticism of FracFocus? Or that somehow we need something else besides. See, the concern I have is no matter what we do, we always have to have more. It's never enough. So have we addressed those concerns in terms of FracFocus?
We always view it as a continuing project that will continue to be improved, and as we get requests and inputs, we'll work on those as needed. I think the dynamic of it with 45,000 wells, well records in there already, this concept of scraping data and aggregating it, we've looked at that issue, and quite frankly, it's just too error-prone to allow that to happen. There's just too many potential problems with that. And so we're here to meet the needs of the public. We're here to meet the needs of the regulatory and everybody else.
Well, and Mr. Chairman, but that is a question I want to ask some of the other members of this panel. Well, here's the thing, and I said this in my opening statement, and so I do want to engage others on this too. I really believe that a states-first approach can help us do a lot more, and I don't mean just in energy production, I mean in innovation that will help us produce more energy from more different sources, both traditional and renewable, with better environmental stewardship. I think that that's the way to go, rather than having kind of this big, ponderous, federal, one-size-fits-all, and it ends up kind of tying a lot of things up, and then I think a lot of the innovation doesn't happen. We don't get the energy, and we actually don't get the improvements to environmental stewardship we would if we provide some flexibility. So the two things I really want to explore with this panel, it's a great panel you've put together. I want to compliment both the chairman and the ranking member. I think it's a great mix. It's the kind of mix that we need to make some progress here, is how do we hit that balance where we have transparency, so people are comfortable that everybody knows what's going on, hence the FracFocus, transparency, foster understanding, but then also have a comfort level that state regulators are out there, and as long as they're doing a good job, that we don't need to pile then additional tiers of federal regulation on top of them, which may not work for their part of the country or for the type of energy they're producing and so forth. Hydraulic fracturing in North Dakota is different than hydraulic fracturing in New York or Pennsylvania or Ohio. We go down 2 miles, 2 miles. That's not potable groundwater anybody's drawing. And there's many impermeable layers between that and the water supply. So we're down there 2 miles primarily for oil. We produce gas as a byproduct. To say that that has to be regulated exactly the same as the Marcellus or the Utica, where you're in a much shallower environment and you're primarily after gas, it doesn't make sense. So, but to get the kind of legislation that will lead us to the kind of regulation that makes some darn sense, we're going to have to work together. So we've got to get a comfort level between government, industry, and various groups and associations that say, okay, the transparency is there, we know what's going on, people can see what's going on, hence things like FracFocus, and then there's got to be some level of trust that, you know, that we can truly empower these states and that they're responsible for the primary regulation. We talked in terms then of what's the federal role. And I would like to think, as long as there's some transparency and understanding, and that the states then are doing a good job taking a lead, that we're going to provide some flexibility. So how do we get there? Starting with transparency. It seems to me it always starts with transparency. And then moving on to the kind of laws maybe where we can get some agreement among different groups that maybe have different interests, because I don't know how we're going to pass any legislation around here if we don't do that. So FracFocus, from whoever wants to, you know, weigh in here, they're working to provide a tool that our state, Alaska, many other states that produce an awful lot of oil and gas require. We require that our companies use it. And we got companies from all over. A lot of these, almost every company here does business in our state. They have to do that. So from a transparency standpoint, are we getting there? What else do we have to do? And, you know, I asked, you know, whether FracFocus is going to make some of these changes. I know that this concept of being able to dump the data is important. You say you're working on it. How about, you know, from Mr. Brownstein or from some of the environmental groups? How are we doing? Are they getting there? What else do they have to do?
So thank you,
And
Senator.
at this point, we now have 2 important public policy issues on the table. One is a focus on FracFocus and what it does and how it might be improved. And then another important issue raised by Senator Hoeven about how you might look at ensuring that there is appropriate deference to the states, while at the same time perhaps having something of a federal minimum standard. That was something that the senator from North Dakota and Francis Beinecke went into, and what was striking is when the discussion focused to that second point, the point of the relationship where the states would be given a wide berth and considerable deference, but you'd have a minimum federal standard. People started coming to the committee and say, well, API, obviously an industry group has been working with environmentalists. Maybe the kind of approach they're talking about could be the basis for the federal minimum. Other people suggested that the state of Colorado, which worked hard at trying to bring industry and environmental people together, that might be the basis of something resembling a sort of federal backstop, if you would characterize it. But the senator from North Dakota has put a second important issue on the table, the relationship of how you might give the states a wide berth and considerable deference, but within some federal minimum standard, which is what's really done in a variety of environmental policy areas. That's one issue. And we also have the question of the FracFocus issue and how it works, whether it can be improved. And I happen to share Senator Hoeven's point. You know, the balance here is to find ways, for example, to make sure the information is correct, which has been brought to the committee by a number of people, but to do it without what Senator Hoeven was talking about, essentially trying to game the system and drown people in information and the like. So you have two policy issues now on the table, and let's just make sure we get a cross-section of input here.
Senator Hoeven, let me answer your question, because I agree with you about transparency. And I do think that is the bedrock of everything that we can accomplish here. And let me also say that the improvements that the Groundwater Protection Council are about to make to FracFocus will be a substantial improvement, particularly in relationship to the state agencies' abilities to access and use the information that's being provided. One of the elements of it that I think is most important is the integration of the information that's being supplied to FracFocus and the risk-based data management systems that several of the states have implemented. And searchability of information in conjunction with those risk-based management systems can, we think, yield to better results in terms of implementation and enforcement of the state regulations that many panelists have talked about. But let me also say that transparency is an important principle for the general public. And this is an area that we have talked to the Groundwater Protection Council about, and we have worked with the Groundwater Protection Council in the improvements that they are making, and we applaud them for it. But we do think that over time, a next important step is to find ways for the public to have more access to the data that's being supplied, so that local communities and landowners can have the information that they need to feel comfortable that the actions that are taking place in their communities are ones that are safe and appropriate.
Could we ask Mr. Balut just to respond to that? Would that be all right, Mr. Chairman? Could you respond to that? I mean, he's talking about what you need to have a complete product. Are you going there?
Yeah, no, we agree. We appreciate the efforts and the thought of the integration of the two packages. We need to ensure that the operators are in compliance with our state rules and look at those. And if they're not, then there's an enforcement action that's appropriate. So that integration and help with a lot of people here at the table that have helped fund those actions have been extremely important to make it an effective regulatory tool, as well as the educational aspect that it does.
We have three industry. If your dance card is up, I assume you'd like to talk. So why don't we, I think Mr. Davidson, you were first.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I think we're on a really great question, because it goes back to, what we can do to increase public's trust and confidence in what we're doing. And first of all, I want to say I really applaud what FracFocus has done, because if you go back just a few short years, we didn't have a mechanism for disclosure that could be easily adopted through our industry. And clearly, I think I speak for not only my company but others that are represented here, that we truly believe that disclosure is one of those important things that will help give the public confidence, because before that, they were asking the question, well, what are you pumping into that well? And with FracFocus, we can now do that in a very short time. And I also applaud the enhancements that will continue to happen to make that more searchable, more accessible. On the question of looking at things such as a minimum federal standard going across, two of us, actually there's several of us that are operators in Colorado, but Noble Energy is certainly, it's a large part of our business. We believe that Colorado has put forward some very, very sound requirements for our operations there, and some of them are tough, and they were worked through many constituencies to develop those, but I would not be I would be careful in saying that those might be the appropriate rules for Texas or Pennsylvania. Many of them were adopted because of the specific conditions in Colorado, and so I think we have to be very careful. I think we got a great set of standards in Colorado. I appreciate what we're working on, but I don't think necessarily they are the best solution for what we're doing, for instance, in West Virginia or in Pennsylvania.
Very good. Mr. Britches.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I'll go back to a study that I mentioned earlier. It was a National Petroleum Council's Prudent Development Study that was submitted to the Department of Energy in 2011. It was a 2-year study in which we had over 100 companies, agencies, and institutions participate. And in this study, the vast majority of the companies and the institutions and agencies that you see at this table were represented. We had over 400 participants. Over half of them were from outside of the oil and gas industry. And what these participants found was that one of the most important things that the industry do is increase the community engagement. And by doing that, they needed to provide more transparency. So the recommendation, one of the key recommendations, had to do with FracFocus, with the recognition that FracFocus was providing a huge public service, and we needed more transparency about the chemicals that were going into the ground. So the key recommendations that came from this had to do with all companies. The recommendation from the National Petroleum Council was that all companies that hydraulically fracture should use FracFocus, should report the ingredients in FracFocus. Further, that the federal government, for all federal lands, require, as a condition for leasing, that companies that hydraulically fracture on federal lands use FracFocus as a reporting tool. So I wanted to bring that up. I think there were two important recommendations, and again, focus on transparency and community engagement.
Mr.
Chairman?
Yeah.
Why don't we take a quick survey of how many people sitting around the table support FracFocus of our witnesses? Who all supports FracFocus? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I would have answered it's constructive. But let's keep going. We've got Mr. Williams. We've got a couple of environmental folks that would like to testify, and then I'm going to see if I can, pardon me?
Yeah, Mr. Smith
And Mr.
But I think it'd be good to hear from Ms. Mall, and
Yeah,
because they don't support FracFocus, so we want to hear that.
Mr. Williams is next, and we're going to hear from the environmental folks, and then I'm going to ask a question that might tie together FracFocus and the role of the states and the federal government. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just got in the queue around when Senator Hogan was talking about states and FracFocus, and I thought you raised some excellent points. And I think when we think about FracFocus, and I'll just say that ExxonMobil fully supports transparency and full disclosure of hydraulic fracturing chemicals. But when we think about something like FracFocus that was sponsored by the Groundwater Protection Council, now GCC, as well as Stronger, that perhaps Mr. Garvin would want to expound on a little bit, I think you're looking at a bit of a sweet spot between getting the best of both worlds, where we have state primacy and the states taking the lead, and the ability to respond to local conditions with fit-for-purpose regulations, with the ability with an organization like Stronger that looks at the state, all the state reporting, all the state regulations, and gives them some thoughts on what other states are doing that might be applicable to their state regulations, and provides a bit of a refresh on an ongoing basis to make sure the states keep up with it as technology changes. And FracFocus, I think, is just a very good efficiency tool because it's really the states that would be requiring the disclosure. We voluntarily put our information into FracFocus, as do many other companies, but many states, like Texas and others, are requiring it, and they're requiring it through FracFocus. They're allowing us to submit through FracFocus, which is a nice efficiency measure. So those are, and also on Stronger, you have the opportunity for federal representation to weigh in on the state regulations as well.
Ms. Mull, Ms. Nardone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We support a public website that's fully transparent, and that could be FracFocus. But the challenge with FracFocus right now is because it's not a government website, it doesn't have the government standards that the public needs to have confidence in the information. It doesn't have government record keeping or accountability rules. Companies can choose what they claim to be trade secrets. The form doesn't match always what states are requiring companies to submit. And therefore, we feel like a government website that's managed under government rules with a legitimate process to determine what truly are trade secrets and deserve protection, if there are any, is very important. There was a Harvard Law School report on FracFocus that just came out recently, and they found, for example, that some companies are claiming trade secrets ingredients in some states and disclosing them in others, that there's inconsistency and that there's inaccuracies, that chemical numbers have been submitted that actually aren't real numbers. So we think we need a government-managed website that has full public access and has government standards for accountability and oversight and enforcement. And while the transparency and disclosure is essential, I think it goes to the other point that that Senator Hoeven and you have made, that it's only part of a solution. It doesn't prevent water contamination. It helps understand if there is water contamination, which is why we think federal rules are so important. And can I jump to the federal state thing for 1 second, or you want to wait on that?
Sure. Let's, Ms. Nardone, can I just ask one question of Mr. Smitherman, then I'm going to recognize you, and Senator Barrasso's also been waiting. But just on this point, so we can get a sense of what states can do and what states can't do. Mr. Smitherman, I'm not clear about whether a state, yours or others, can step in if inaccurate information is posted on FracFocus. Can you tell us what the state of play is? Because this kind of goes to our effort to see if we can sort through how to give the states this broad berth and at the same time perhaps have some minimum standards. Can your state do anything, or other states with inaccurate information on FracFocus?
Mr. Chairman, I think Texas was the first state to require our operators to report their information on FracFocus. We would certainly be concerned if it were being reported inaccurately, and I assume that our staff would step in and require that it be done accurately. There's no reason to make it mandatory if it's going to be inaccurate.
I want to go to Ms. Nardone. I'm just still not clear what the process is going to be. As you say, you know, if somebody finds it, we can take some steps. We've heard some concerns on it. I think FracFocus is a constructive effort. We're going to spend some time on looking at how we might improve it again to try to see if we can find some common ground. Ms. Nardone, and then Senator Brass. Yeah.
See, to me, this is a very valuable discussion, because if there are things we can do that provide confidence to groups and association that FracFocus works. Now, maybe it's the state has to have some verification if we use FracFocus. I mean, to me, this is a kind of constructive conversation that maybe can help us make some progress. So I appreciate it very much.
Ms. Nardone, and then Senator Barrasso.
Sure. So adding into what Mr. Smitherman said, and adding into what Amy had also said, that verification process is really important. And that is one of the concerns with it being a private entity that manages it versus a public. So who is actually verifying the data? What kind of quality assurance, quality control is there? And what steps are the state agencies taking to ensure that someone is confirming the accuracy of the data? The data is only as good as what the states require it to be. So, if a state doesn't allow for full public disclosure, doesn't require all chemicals to be listed, the public still is in the dark. And that is one of the other biggest concerns that we have, which I think I'd like to get to when we talk about the state-based transparencies. But the aggregation is a good step. It definitely improves the usability of FracFocus. Whatever system is used, there's still a lot of improvements that would need to be made. States are taking much more aggressive positions on fracking, on disclosure of fracking chemicals. So ensuring that you have a system set up to place the data in advance of fracking, since many of them are requiring chemical data be provided many days in advance of the frac job actually taking place. With it not being a public entity, there's also some other questions. Will it be around in 10 years as a private entity? What kind of data retention will it be? Will it be containing data forever and ever and ever? And then also, from a public position, they're not subject to administrative or public appeals. There isn't any kind of foiable process that you can go through to get the data in an effective time. So in and when a landowner is complaining about some kind of groundwater contamination, having their well sampled, getting what chemicals may have been used, it isn't a public entity, so they don't have the same sort of requirements. And I think that is one of the biggest concerns.
Very
with
good.
FracFocus.
Senator Burke.
The question I have, and maybe we could just go around, and I'm just going to ask, do this in 2 sentences, please, so I don't use up everyone else's time. But the point was brought up, I think, by Ms. Mall. Well, FracFocus, okay, and Mr. Brownstein, thank you for your comments. Transparency is important. Appreciate that. But the comment was essentially, okay, yes, FracFocus is good as a tool, but it's not enough, I think Ms. Mall said, because it's not government run, and therefore, we know that they're taking all the necessary steps. So my question is, does it have to be government run, or could it be something like FracFocus where the states, for example, just have some ability to verify and ensure the data is sound? And I'd just like to go around and say, would that work? Mr. Williams, maybe starting from an industry perspective, if the state had some ability to audit the system or something like that, or, how could we provide that level of verification, I think, that Ms. Mall raised in the best or simplest way? And just 1 or 2 sentences from each of you in terms of how we do that.
Senator, I do think that would work. I think that the states own the data that their regulations require us to submit, and they have every right and should make sure there's quality control for their data. So I think your proposal would work fine.
So some audit system would work.
Some audit system by the states for the wells in their states, respective states, using the FracFocus database. Yes.
I would fully support an audit process as well. As a public company, we already rely on audits to make sure that our investors have confidence in the data that we are reporting publicly. And I would think, for instance, as an example, Chairman Smitherman, if the Texas Railroad Commission decided to put in place some sort of audit process, the spot check, to make sure that the data is accurately being reported, I think we would certainly welcome that.
So from our perspective, it makes a great deal of sense for this audit function to exist for the states, and also to manage the timing of the input from the companies by the states. That would be something that would be required. Therefore, you'd be able to deal with the issues that Ms. Nardone brought up earlier. One other thing I might throw in here is perhaps federal funding to help bolster the organization's ability to provide the data and to have this great transparency that we're talking about.
We're short of money. No.
I agree that an audit approach from multiple states would help the system. I actually would, I believe that would be a more dynamic system than simply having one organization, that being the federal government, taking a look at it. I think having multiple state organizations with different perspectives, having an ability to audit is actually a stronger system.
verification, public access to the data, and disclosure of chemicals used throughout the production process, not just hydraulic fracturing itself, are important elements, and we think there are many ways to skin that cat.
Senator, an audit function is very important. If the BLM is going to be using FracFocus for all federal leases, we do think we need strong federal rules to ensure that there are standards in place for the record keeping, how the information is treated, how trade secrets are determined, so beyond just an audit.
Could the states do that, Ms. Moll?
Yes, the states could do that. For federal leases, the BLM is proposing that there be, for states that don't require it, that companies would have to submit if they have a federal lease. And because the states have varying information requirements and their regulations vary differently, we think there should be a federal uniform requirement for reporting. The key thing about FracFocus is, let's just say state A requires 5 things to be reported and state B requires 8. There need to be places to put all 8 on the form, so that everything that's required in every state has a place to go. And that's not currently the case with FracFocus.
I agree with the comments that Amy made on BLM land requiring consistent reporting across all states of all chemicals. An audit function is essential. We need to make sure that there are opportunities for the state agencies to verify the data, ensure that it is truly accurate, some kind of quality assurance, quality control piece. Again, though, the issue becomes that it still isn't a public entity. They are not subject to the same kinds of public review requests that a state agency or a federal agency is. And so what happens when you need to get the data and you can't get it?
Senator, if there are enhancements to be made, we'll certainly take a look at it. But I do think it's important to realize that in my state, we've already moved on. We're talking about recycling. We're talking about well integrity. We're talking about additional cementing. I mean, we're trying to be proactive across all the issues. And I'm a little surprised that we have so much conversation on FracFocus, because we addressed that some time ago in my state.
But, Mr. Smitherman, that's exactly my point. I think the states are doing a lot, and for the ones that go ahead, we want to empower them and enable them to do that. We don't want the federal government to come in and start telling you what you have to do, so somehow we've got to get some comfort level and agreement so that, fine, everybody's providing the transparency and doing that and, you know, meeting that minimum standard, if you will, and then everybody can run ahead, you know, without having the federal government come in and say, no, you have to do all these other things this way.
And
So
you're right.
That's exactly what we want. You said you're doing exactly what we want.
And to be clear, we do it because the issues percolate up to us because we're so prolific in the space. They come from Mr. Brownstein's organization, from our staff, from the industry, from mayors and city council members. We take all those, we synthesize them, we put the stakeholders in a room, and we come up with a solution. This well integrity rule we're going to adopt tomorrow has been 13 months in the process. It's a lot better today than it was 13 months ago, but not everyone got everything they wanted.
Well, and I think that's great. And we just want to empower you to be able to do just that.
The FracFocus area is one we have great confidence in, and I think it's reflective of the entire industry in the sense that the shale revolution, the energy that we've gotten from the shale revolution, has come about through technological innovation. And as Mr. Davidson said, in good governance, we're used to auditing. So auditing is nothing new, nothing we wouldn't expect, and certainly something we'd endorse. But we have great confidence that the same innovative spirit that's been used to bring us the shale revolution can be applied to the reporting process and transparency, and FracFocus on a state level is a good way to do it.
Agree.
Trust but verify. That's why we do audits. The states can do it.
West Virginia decided to.
Just to answer a couple of those questions, I mean, states are government. We are chartered as government, and we manage it as state association, so the states are managing it. We're in complete control of all the data that's in there. But states have very, very broad powers on looking at data submitted. I mean, if we're getting data from any operation or anything that's inaccurate, then the person submitting that is liable for improper reporting. We've had those regulations for decades, and I know, Amy, you were talking about different states and different levels. FracFocus can accommodate any different type of chemical registries that you want to put in it. And it is flexible enough to allow for those state differences and will continue to be. The reporting back out that we've talked about, yes, that is very important. We've heard audit and verify. We're absolutely doing that, and we will continue to work on it.
Let's do this. I want to have you respond in writing to me on one additional question on FracFocus, and I want to let Senator Murkowski wrap that up, and then while Senator Hoeven's here, have a discussion about flaring, which we really haven't touched on, and Senator Hoeven's done some very thoughtful work here. The question I'll ask you about in writing, and then let Senator Murkowski wrap this up, is the committee has heard from a number of parties talking about why, in their view, the public ought to have the information on the chemicals that's used before the fracking takes place. And we've tried to reach out to environmental folks and industry people with companies saying that often there needs to be adjustments to the chemicals during the fracking operation, and then people have said, well, information could be modified as we went. I'd like to have all of you who are interested in this issue respond in writing to me on this question within the next week. Is that acceptable to people? So we'll pose it to you in writing, and then Senator Murkowski can have the last word on FracFocus, and then we can get into this flaring issue, which my colleague from North Dakota and I have talked about a number of times.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that the extent of this conversation has been very, very helpful to all of us. This is more just kind of a procedural question for those of you within the industry. Whether you're Noble or Exxon or Anadarko or others, you're working in multiple states around the country here. You're working in some states that require FracFocus. You're working in states that don't have a different level of disclosure. In some, it's the detail of the chemicals to be disclosed is different. How do you as a company deal with these multiple requirements? Now, I can understand if say, you're doing work up in North Dakota and you're in the Bakken, and then you've got another operation out in Pennsylvania. So you're, as has been stated by my friend here, the process and what we're dealing with in different regions is different. But if you're in the same region and you've got different disclosure requirements effectively, how are you as a company dealing with this? Do you, in Anadarko, for instance, just provide for a level of disclosure that meets the most stringent requirement of all the states that you're working in, or do you just meet what each state requires? And if some state requires really a very minimal amount of disclosure, how do you deal with that?
Thank you for your question, Senator. The way that we handle it with regard to FracFocus is in all states, everywhere where we hydraulically fracture, we report through FracFocus. So it makes no
difference. Even though you're not required to?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
That is correct. So it does not matter what state we're working in, we disclose everywhere. And with regard to FracFocus, Anadarko is the #1 reporter. We have the most reports within FracFocus of the wells that have been fractured since its inception.
How about the other companies? Do you follow the same, Mr. Williams?
Same for us.
Yes.
We have been for quite a while in putting all wells in FracFocus, regardless of the state's requirements.
Mr. Davidson?
Yes, we were pursuing using FracFocus before it was required by certain states. And I would also add that the question is important when you get into the web of regulation, because it's not just finding the most stringent. Where we really can be challenged is when they may be equal but different. And so we need to make sure that we are in total compliance in each state. We want to make sure. It's not like that we're looking for the toughest or the easiest. We want to comply because those regulations were developed because of specific state needs and specific circumstances. In other areas, and I'll give an example that's a little unique, but in the case of when the U.S. changed its Deepwater Gulf of Mexico regulations, we decided those regulations were appropriate globally, and so they're not even, although they're not required by other countries in the world, we moved to embark and use those because we believed as a company they were the best practices.
Is there anybody else that does it differently? Halliburton's doing the same? Mr. Crane?
Yes, we do it the same way, all the same amount of information, comprehensive.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.